Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. This is Jessica. I am here with...
I am Maureen Kilmer, and I am the author of Suburban Hell.
Which is a fabulous title for a book, especially being somebody who grew up and lives in the suburbs. And this is like, it was definitely very different. And I did a little research before this. And is this your first like horror venture?
It is. So I had previously published under my married name and did more like book club fiction type things, straight kind of contemporary women's fiction. But this is my first foray into some horror adjacent stuff.
So tell me where this whole story came from and why a she shed?
So like I said, I had previously published kind of book club type stuff. And, the pandemic hit and I was getting a little burned out of writing just straight emotional stories. I mean, things were, imploding in the world. My kids were home. So I was trying to write more, book club fiction and, was just kind of hitting a stumbling block. And so I kind of took a step back and I knew that I wanted to write a story about the suburbs. I live in a suburb. I grew up in the suburbs, as you said. And I kept thinking there's so much here to mine. So it started out as kind of a comedic suburban tale. Because again, there's so much material. I mean, neighbors fighting about taking trees down and things, bake sales and things like that. So I started writing it like that. And then I kept thinking there was something missing. And, I wasn't sure what it was, but, I kept writing. And then, funnily enough, one night I had a dream. It sounds so cliche, but I had a dream that there was a demon in our neighborhood. And, and then it's a spoiler for the book, but then something happened. And so I woke up and I texted my neighbor and I'm like, oh, I had this crazy dream that, this happened. And she goes, yeah, that would happen in our neighborhood. And thus I was like, okay, well, let's see how this goes. I've always been a big fan of horror. I grew up, I think I watched Poltergeist when I was like 6, thanks to like a terrible babysitter. But horror has always been a love of mine. So I was like, all right, well, let's, blend this. And I didn't want to do just like straight horror. I wanted to do, because horror comedy is like my favorite genre. So I started to blend the two and also realized that, so many of the funny things that are in suburbia can also be really scary on many levels. So that's kind of where it all came from.
Yeah, I was enjoying it. You definitely had some references to Poltergeist in the book, which was pretty great. Yeah, I don't know why babysitters like showed kids horror movies, but you're not the only person who had that experience. But this has been a really good time for horror and horror comedy. And like you said, like I think the suburbs is a really good place to go. I mean, really, like some of the best horror is suburban horror.
Yeah.
So like your characters, so your main character, Amy, she lives in the suburbs. She has like her group of friends. And then there's like the ultra crazy PTA moms who are scary in their own way. But like one of her friends, Liz, there's just something off about her, and it sort of brings back some other trauma that she had in her life. And she starts enlisting some people trying to figure out what's going on with Liz and how this is connected to the greater neighborhood. The group of friends, are they like sort of based on people did you sort of know that you were going to have like one who came from a religious household, one who came from here? How did they all sort of file into the group?
So in the book, there are a lot of people that are based on real people that I know. The group of friends, I have a wonderful group of friends in our neighborhood, and everyone's a little quirky and different. And so I started sort of with the archetypes of my actual friends and then kind of turned up the dial. I mean, none of them come from like a crazy religious background or things like that. I kind of added that in later. But definitely I kind of started with real people that I knew, because when the things that I've written before and when I write, I do look to my own life for inspiration and people that I know and to make the characters real people. So it's a joke. So after the book was sold, I bought my 3 closest friends t-shirts that say fictional character. Like I said, they're not, exact. I mean, I definitely like mixed and matched and added crazy stuff in, but certainly, and some of the conversations that they have in the book, when my friends haven't read the book yet, when they read it, they're going to be like, hey, I said that. So absolutely. It's, ripped from the headlines of my neighborhood, so to speak.
So do you, you said that you're a big horror fan, and I also enjoy horror. What are some of your favorites? And is that the change I see in the background?
It is. Yes,
this isn't a video podcast, but for those listening, I interviewed Kristen Miller earlier in the summer. It's Kirsten Miller, I'm sorry, about the Change, which was another suburban horror-esque story, but a completely different one and lots of fun.
Yeah. So that book was fantastic. As far as some of my favorites that I've read lately, I love Grady Hendrix, obviously, horror comedy.
How excited are you for My Best Friend's Exorcism? I definitely felt just like a very nice little sort of like nod to Grady's book. They're very, very different, Suburban Hell and My Best Friend's Exorcism, but there's certainly, I felt like there was kind of like a little tip of the hat.
Absolutely, there was. I read that book before I started writing this, and I'm certain it probably wormed its way into some part of my consciousness. His books were the ones that I really first read.
Nice reference there.
His books were the first ones that I really read that was like, oh, you can write this and just kind of go bonkers. And be funny and put in, because as my editor told me when I was writing this book, because it was sold on proposal, so it wasn't a full manuscript. She was like, just go crazy and then I'll tell you and I'll pull you back. And I was like, perfect. So I love his books. I recently read, it's not a new book by any means, but Come Closer by Sarah Gran. And that was fantastic. It's actually about another possession, but it's from the point of the woman who's becoming possessed. And you kind of wonder if it's a possession or if it's something else. I also love Paul Tremblay's books, the Paul Bear's Club that just came out. So those are kind of my go-tos. But honestly, like I read everything and anything across the board that's horror adjacent.
So I know that you mentioned that the different characters are based on people who you're friends with. What about Amy? Was she sort of your inner dialogue?
Certainly there are parts of Amy that I brought from myself. The idea of trying to balance working and being at home. And, while I'm not a social worker, obviously, but there's a lot of those moments where it's like, okay, I need to get something done, work related, or, she's looking for jobs, I have to write. And it's like, here's the iPad, here's Netflix, I don't just eat whatever snack you want, give me 10 minutes. And so I definitely brought that to the page, and my husband, he, works full time out of the home. And so it's like, all summer it was like me versus the children, like it was like, there were days where they were on iPads all day. There were days, where they were kind of fending for themselves, but, so certainly that piece, especially, and also the piece where I think, with Amy, she moved to the suburbs and was kind of like, I mean, we've lived in the suburbs for a long time. But, Amy moves from the city to the suburbs and is kind of like, wow, okay, this is different. And while I've lived in the suburbs for a long time, when we moved to this neighborhood, I think 8 years ago, it was very different. It was like block parties, and everyone knew each other, and everyone knows each other's business. And oh, you got a new fence, and it was suffocating. Certainly I've settled into that and found the good parts of it too. But it was like it almost felt like everyone knew. Every time I walked the dog, things like that. And that took a lot of getting used to. And I've found, like I said, the good parts of it. If my kid is sick at school and, I'm out, I can call my neighbor to come pick him up. Things like, it takes a village and all that. But, there are some things that you need to kind of accept. So I wanted to bring that to Amy as well.
Do you think you would continue writing in this genre?
Yes, I'm actually contracted for another book that is due next month.
Oh.
Yes. So yeah, I mean, it's been really a lot of fun. Like I said, I've actually, before I did book club, I wrote in the YA space too. So I've kind of like dabbled in a lot of different things.
Which YA books did you write? Now I'm wondering if my research was not good enough, because now
I've written under a lot of different names. Those were published under Maureen Lurk. So like, I'm scattershot. I'm all over the place. When you're in publishing, you kind of have to become a chameleon, so to speak. So, I wrote in that space for a while, and that was fun. Like I said, and I wrote in the book club space. But I love writing in this space because it's something different. And I think it's really cool to be able to tell a story and also kind of turn up the dial with the horror element. I mean, horror is really about, it's not, Halloween isn't about Michael Myers.
It's really, there's emotion in it. And I think that's why it's doing so well now too.
Yeah.
Because emotion is so high, and because things are so crazy and sort of terrible that are happening outside. And there's like some real comfort in sort of like distorting the mundane, like suburbia.
Well, I think it's also, the past few years have been so traumatic, on so many different levels that like, you watch the news and you're like, it's terrible. You turn it off, and then you read a book. You're like, well, at least, we don't have a demon living next door. Like,
yes.
But I mean, horror is really a construct that allows us to explore what scares us, but in a dialed up way. Like Halloween isn't about, Michael Myers. It's about being afraid to leave your kids alone, or being a babysitter and, being in charge of these kids on your own, and how would you handle danger? So, I mean, I think, and it allows us to explore it from a safe distance.
Yeah, and there was, I mean, it's interesting. There was a lot of horror of like sort of like the mid-90s that had this weird suburban twist to it, like The Burbs, for instance.
Yeah.
Which I was not aware was horror before I watched it.
I mean, it's like horror adjacent, I would say.
Totally. Well, I mean, like, and this is something I say constantly on this podcast. Most of the movies that were out when I was a kid were horror adjacent. Goonies is horror adjacent.
Totally. Ghostbusters.
Now Ghostbusters is interesting though, because the first Ghostbusters had a PG rating, but that was because PG-13 didn't exist. Yes.
I did not know that.
Ghostbusters, same thing with Goonies, actually.
Really?
Yes, this is my film background coming in. So like those, and like even like Gremlins, so like those are movies that were kind of like, oh, is this a kids movie or is this an adults movie? Is this a horror movie or is this a comedy? Well, maybe it's both. Maybe it's a little bit of everything. Like I call Goonies, which I guess is kind of like a suburban story, but not 100%. I call it for kids because right, I mean,
totally.
Yeah, and the joke that someone I know said, they're like, well, it's they don't, like, all the guys don't like end up having relations
Right.
with the one girl. And I'm like, yeah, but that one character does trick Angie into kissing her
Right. And you watch that again and you're like, oh, whoa,
yeah,
okay.
100%. So
you're like, that doesn't seem right.
But it does have like, the Losers Club, the Goonies are, like the unpopular kids, and it does have like, like the cute redhead who's with them, and it's not it, but it does have those qualities, which I think is what informed like something like Stranger Things, for instance.
I was just going to say that. I mean, and Stranger Things is like such a kick to watch now. I mean, so my daughter watches it and loves it, and I watch it too and love it. And, she's not like totally getting all the 80s references she's sort of getting it, but like the nostalgia piece, for me watching that is just fantastic.
And it's made Kate Bush and Metallica the songs of the summer.
No kidding. I just saw Master of Puppets hit the Billboard chart, and they actually played it here in Chicago at Lollapalooza. And Lollapalooza is all like kids in their like 20s, or younger or whatever. And they played Master of Puppets, and the whole crowd went crazy. I was like, who would have thought?
Well, I mean, yeah, and just sort of looking at suburban hell and then looking at something like Stranger Things, in a way, it's like, from the parents' point of view, like, the only parent in Stranger Things who's not 100% clueless, unless you count Hopper, who I guess is a parent, there's Joyce, but Joyce, like the Wheelers are like 100% like those neighbors that just have no clue, and everybody, so like I'm reading Suburban Things and I'm like, this is kind of fun because this takes that part of it, but it puts it, against like a few moms who are trying to keep up, like they're the ones who are trying to solve the mystery and save their friend.
Well, and I think too, when I was writing this, like with so many things in media and books and movies, like the moms like are clueless. They're like dorky and they have no idea what's going on. And they're like, oh, why were you out late? And the kid was like battling a ghost or something. So I wanted to make a book, I wanted to write something where the moms actually knew what was going on. They weren't idiots. I wanted to write a book where the moms were people who, quote unquote, play in the sandbox, but also kick up the sand.
Much like, what was it? The Southern Book
Club Guide to Slaying Vampires. Yeah. Exactly. That was fantastic.
Yeah. Another Grady. He's just so good. He's great. We've had him on so many times. And
have you? Oh.
I would never turn down a chance to get him to come back.
No kidding. I'd love to go to one of his signings sometimes. I know he has a new book coming out, I think next year. I think they pushed his book back, which I was very sad about.
Yeah, he's super cool. But yeah, so this is definitely fun. Would you be writing in the same neighborhood for your next book, or is it going to be a completely different one?
No, it's going to be a completely different one. Although I had a lot of fun writing in this neighborhood, we are doing something different, moving to a different neighborhood, but still very based in reality, something that, centers around families, relationships, kind of, they call it like domestic horror, where it's like based around a family, neighborhood, real life people, which I think is the scariest and most interesting, because then you can really put yourself there and imagine this happening to you.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please come back and talk to us about it at some point.
Would love to. I really appreciate you having me on.
Well, once again, this is Jessica from Syosset Library. Our guest today was
Maureen Kilmer.
And we are going to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.